And now on to a brand new segment. Welcome to Eddy's Final Cut, where I get to say what I actually think. No hedging, no on the hand, and no, it's complicated. And today's final cut is Myth, Mud, and the most overhyped man in Hollywood, Christopher Nolan. The Odyssey, $250 million. The first feature film in history shot entirely on IMAX 70mm cameras. Stars Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Tom Holland, Zendaya, Robert Pattinson, Charlize Theron, Lupita Nyong'o, and Elon Musk having a meltdown on the internet about the casting choices, which, by the way, was factually wrong on almost every specific claim. But we're going to get to that. 97% on Rotten Tomatoes, a $264 million opening weekend. Let's talk about it. Let's start with what Nolan, in my view, actually got right. And I went into this film genuinely wanting to love it. And in many moments I did. Matt Damon is great, even magnificent. I mean that without any qualification whatsoever. This might be one of his best performances in his career, though not his most famous. I personally preferred him in The Martian. And while many believe that he was miscast for this role, I had no major issues with it. He plays Odysseus, not as a legend, but a man. And later on, we get to see him as sort of an anti-hero. A man who did terrible things during a terrible war. Spent 10 years being punished for them. And isn't entirely sure he deserves to go home. He grew even a full beard for an entire year because Christopher Nolan refused the use of artificial beards. And somehow that one detail tells you everything about how seriously both of them took this role. Anne Hathaway plays his wife, the Queen of Ithaca, Penelope. She's quietly devastating. Even though throughout the majority of the film, she's, in almost every scene you see her in, always weaving, and the weave is never finished, by the way. There's a scene where she's sitting in her loom, and the stillness of her body alone tells you more about the 20 years of waiting than any amount of dialogue ever could. Now, that's not just acting, that's communicating. And that is exactly why you cast someone like Anne Hathaway. Tom Holland plays Odysseus' son, Telemachus. He didn't really surprise me as much, but this is the first non-superhero role I've seen him in where he is fully and completely trying to play the character without having a mask on, no quips, and not much safety net. He plays a young man growing up in the shadow of a father, having a huge chip on his shoulder, who's simultaneously a legend and an absence. And then we have one of the most outstanding performers in the entire cast, Samantha Morton, who is amazing as Cersei. And I actually think she's going to get a nomination for Best Supporting Actress. She was amazing as playing someone who has suffered at the hands of soldiers in the past and still struggling to overcome and forgive. Now, there's also John Leguizamo, who plays the loyal Eumaeus. He's also someone else to watch out for this Oscars season that's coming up. A career-spanning richness in that performance. And if there's a supporting actor conversation this year, it shouldn't just be Samantha Morton for the female category. His name should be on top of it as well. Ludwig Göransson's score is extraordinary in this film. The Cyclops sequence is horror filmmaking at its finest. It puts you at a lot of unease, and it's a 60-foot practical puppet that they used with real shadows, basically making it genuinely unsettling in many ways that CGI simply cannot replicate. There's a psychological concept called authentic expressiveness. The idea that genuine emotion, even when raw and imperfect, connects with audiences in ways that polished performance simply cannot replicate. When this film is working, And it's basically when Matt Damon is carrying the weight of Odysseus's guilt, with Anne Hathaway communicating 20 years without so much as a word from Odysseus. Tom Holland navigating the impossible gravity of a father who is more than myth than man. It's because these performers are operating at a level of authentic expressiveness that no amount of IMAX grandeur could manufacture. The technology serves the performance. That is Nolan at his absolute best. And that's where the defense ends. Because we need to talk about what also doesn't work. And there's quite a few. And it's also significantly more of it than a 97% score would imply. Problem 1, the pacing of the film and the first act itself. So it's a very long movie, 2 hours and 52 minutes long. And it feels the first act being very fast-paced, which is very typical in a Chris Nolan film. It's more like a montage pretending to be a movie. We're never really introduced to these characters properly. We're simply being told about them from other characters. And that's one thing you do notice in the first act, especially the film, which was a major issue for me. Because the first 20 to 30 minutes of the film was cut really fast at such relentless efficiency that by the time the film slows down, let's say half of the film, you don't know anyone well enough, or you don't genuinely connect to any of the characters. You've been just fed information. You haven't been given actual people you could relate to. And then by the half of the first half of the movie's finishing and then the second half begins, the pacing is so slow that you just wish you press the fast forward button at a lot of times, actually. And you do feel that it's a long movie. And in a story about 20 years of longing, loss, and loyalty, that's quite a costly mistake to make, and not just in the first half hour, but with the remainder of the film. Research on parasocial relationships, the psychological bonds audiences form with fictional characters, shows that emotional investment requires time. You need to observe a character making choices, showing vulnerability, revealing something true about who they are or who they were, before the plot demands something of them. Yet in this case, Nolan's montage structure denies us of that time. And then the film asks us to feel enormous things with a lot of weight for people we just met minutes ago. It's kind of like when you're asked to cry at a stranger's funeral. The grief might be real to you, but you haven't earned the grief yet. And that's oftentimes what the major issue was. Problem 2, the dialogue. Let me just start by saying the dialogue is very clunky. And Chris Nolan has answered numerous times that he's aware of it and just doesn't care. He has said publicly that he does not prioritize dialogue. He believes that cinema is visual and that audiences should absorb story through context and body language. He's actually even described his mixing choices as radical and expressed surprise at how conservative audiences are about wanting to hear what characters say. I mean, he's not wrong that cinema's a visual medium. However, he is wrong that this excuses giving Lupita Nyong'o and Charlize Theron lines that don't really match their talent at all. You cannot simultaneously cast the most magnetic actors alive and write them dialogue that a Wikipedia article would definitely improve. Also, the choice of the American accent. While most films always have their actors using the British accent, primary example was Troy, Brad Pitt, trying to have a British accent, of course. And there's also this one scene where there's this one man who speaks in Greek, and then one of the characters is translating, and then Matt Damon's Odysseus and the other characters speak to him in English. So that's another issue with the dialogue. And then the dialogue is not supposed to be as modern, but I could have given him quite a pass if the dialogue was not too modern, to the point where you're using the F-bomb quite consistently. And also the choice of words such as, instead of father, daddy, which Robert Pattinson uses at least twice, which did bother me quite a lot. Problem number 3, the sound mixing. The sound mixing is usually quite a catastrophe in a Chris Nolan film. You have Nolan, I call it the Nolan disease, that has fully metastasized throughout his films. And multiple people who reviewed the film called the Odyssey sound grudge band, muddy, and loud, which is a phrase I love so much, and I actually want to put it on a t-shirt and wear it to the Oscars. Several critics noted that at home, closed captions would have been mandatory. And the Sirens sequence, one of the most anticipated moments of the entire film, in my view, which Nolan deliberately muted the audio completely. So we're just watching Odysseus screaming, being tied to the mast of the ship, and you cannot hear a single thing, and you cannot even hear what he's screaming towards. The Zeigarnik effect is the principle that incomplete or interrupted experiences are remembered more vividly than actual ones. Nolan clearly understands this. He's built his entire career around it. Leave things unresolved, primarily in Inception, its ending, and the audience leans forward. But there's a limit. When the incompleteness is the sound itself, when you literally cannot hear any of the dialogue whatsoever, the Zeigarnik effect stops creating productive tension and actually starts creating frustration and confusion. Your brain isn't leaning forward anymore or doesn't want to hear more. It's just tired of asking, wait, what did he just say? That's not radical filmmaking. That's actually become a hearing test with a $250 million budget. Problem number 4, the visual palette. The choice of color grading, it's quite dark, muddy, and monochromatic, which is quite infamous in a Nolan film. But in this film in particular, it is on IMAX, on a $250 million budget. They've shot across Greece, Italy, and Morocco. And this is now the 4th consecutive film that Nolan always got the same criticism for. For instance, in Dunkirk, it was too dark and monochromatic. Tenet, flat and monochromatic. Oppenheimer, stagey and monochromatic. The Odyssey, way too dark and monochromatic. He built the most powerful cinema cameras in film history. He shot across 6 continents. The IMAX 70mm format captures color with a depth that makes digital look like a photocopy. And yet, he used it to make everything look like a very expensive rainstorm at night, or even at dusk. At some point, dark and gritty stops being a tone and actually starts being a habit. And habits, unlike choices, don't serve the story. They just show up whether you invited them or not. Problem number 5. This film has absolutely no comic relief, and Homer absolutely did. Now, Homer's Odyssey is not a 3,000-year-old meditation on war, played entirely in shadow. It is also, alongside everything else, genuinely funny. Odysseus, actually, is a trickster. The gods squabble like a dysfunctional family, sort of at Thanksgiving dinner. There's the absurdity of men who cannot stop themselves eating the sun god's cattle after being told a lot of times, repeatedly, explicitly by a goddess, do not eat the sun god's cattle. And they end up eating the cattle anyways. Not just once, every single time. Now, fast forward to Nolan's version. Nolan strips all of that out. The film is ponderously serious from frame one. Not a single moment of genuine levity. Now, I'm not saying that it should have been like the Marvel movies or the DC Comics movies. We're not going that far. But at least having some different moments of comic relief so that you actually feel those parts of seriousness being mixed with levity. Research on emotional processing shows that contrast is what gives tragedy its weight. When everything is equally grave, nothing registers as grave. The brain needs relief, a break, to recognize intensity. Laughter before loss makes the loss land a lot harder, not softer. And that's not a screenwriting opinion. It's how human emotional processing actually works. Homer knew this 3,000 years ago. He actually put jokes in his epic because jokes make the grief heavier, not lighter. Nolan, with all of his genius and successes, apparently did not get the memo. Or he probably got the memo and filed it under conservative audience expectations I don't share, which, given the sound mixing, kind of tracks. Problem 6. The women are underwritten in a film where Homer gives them everything. Here's the irony. Nolan actually spent 6 months being accused of disrespecting the ancient source material because of who he cast. And let's remember, this is when Elon Musk personally weighed in, and that's when the culture war machine ran at full capacity. Okay? And at this time, I was thinking to myself, well, who's handling the PR of this film? Because, Elon Musk was quite aggressive, and was there nobody who could actually refute the things that were being thrown at them? That's why you would have a PR spokesperson, per se, a specialist, an expert in public relations. But Nolan and his production team decided to stay completely quiet. And what occurs when there's total silence and there's not an effort to actually address these circulating rumors? Well, it affects the perception and willingness of most people to go see the film because of so much negative press. So addressing it early on would have been ideal, especially with regards to Elliot Page's character. And then fast forward to 6 months later, the film comes out. Nyong'o plays as twin sisters, Helen of Troy and then Clytemnestra. Both are blink and miss them appearances. Okay. Charlize Theron also plays Calypso, which was fine, but she was very much a supporting character without much dialogue apart from helping Matt Damon's Odysseus remember. Samantha Morton's Circe, one of the most powerful and complex figures in all of Greek mythology, gets only a handful of scenes that don't give Morton nearly enough to work with. The people who screamed about the casting for 6 months were quite obviously wrong about their specific complaints. And they accidentally identified a real problem and just gave it the wrong name. So let's remember that there was a huge controversy about Elliot Page being cast as Achilles. But if you watched just the movie Troy in 2004, you would know that Brad Pitt's Achilles actually dies. Same thing in the Greek mythology. There's no Achilles in the Odyssey, because he's already killed by Paris of Troy, no less. So this idea that Elliot Page is playing Achilles was very much wrong-founded. In fact, Elliot Page only appears in 2 scenes, and he's actually playing a soldier who's actually delivering the Trojan horse. Problem number 7. No one in this film actually talks to each other, and you notice that quite a lot. One of the biggest pet peeves that I've had was the character Agamemnon also. You barely see him say anything, and in the one scene in Hell where he basically says something, you finally hear his voice, but you still don't see his face. Throughout the entire film, in scenes where he does appear, he's just appearing. The Odyssey is a story about a man and his crew going on this Odyssey, loyalty being tested to destruction. We never feel that bond because we never see it built. And Homer has kept you attached to those sailors for 3,000 years, whereas Nolan loses them just in the opening montage. Problem 8. Sinon, played by Elliot Page, is not in Homer at all. I saved this for last because it's almost poetic. Sinon was never a character in the Odyssey. He is not in the Iliad. He's actually in Virgil's Aeneid, which is a Latin epic written approximately 500 years after Homer's Iliad. Different author, different civilization, different language, by the way. So Nolan, who spent months being accused of disrespecting Homer's source material, imported a character from an entirely different ancient author without even acknowledging and giving credit to that author, while actually sidelining all these female characters. And the worst is basically having Zendaya playing as the representation or the manifestation into a human form, only appearing in some scenes. And then you barely hear her say anything throughout the entire film. And now let's talk about the Oscar question and my actual position. I don't think the Odyssey wins Best Picture at the 2027 Academy Awards. And here's why. The recency effect tells us what the most recently experienced items in a sequence are weighted most heavily in memory and judgment. Sort of think to yourselves as someone's lasting impression. The availability heuristic tells us that we overestimate the likelihood of things we can easily bring to mind. The week after a $264 million opening, The Odyssey is the most available, most recent, most vivid film in everyone's minds. And yeah, majority people think it's a masterpiece, so it should be a frontrunner for Best Picture. It's actually the film that people are still talking about. And in fact, people are putting a lot of bets on that. But by February 2027, after 8 months of festival darlings, late-year prestige releases, and whatever Denis Villeneuve does with Dune Part 3, the Academy will be evaluating The Odyssey from a much different psychological distance. And at that distance, structural problems loom larger than they do in the glow of the opening weekend. The Academy has a documented, complicated history for Nolan. For years, they acknowledged his technical brilliance while keeping him from the top prizes. Oppenheimer finally broke that seal. But the question is now whether they return to the same well 3 years later. The last 2 directors to win Best Picture twice in the same decade were Clint Eastwood, 12 years apart, and Milos Forman, 9 years apart. Nolan would be doing it in 3. And Dune Part 3 is coming. And let's not forget about my personal frontrunner, Hail Mary Project. So here's my final verdict. I would give this 3 stars on 5. And that's my rating for this film. It's a pretty good achievement with real, honest limitations. It's a film that reaches for the gods and grazes them. Matt Damon, Samantha Morton, and John Leguizamo give probably the best performances of their careers. And Hathaway doing more with stillness than most actors can do with monologues. A score that should win every award it's eligible for. And a Cyclops scene that will genuinely make you uncomfortable in the best way. But also a first act that doesn't let you in, with dialogue that doesn't always serve its cast, sound that requires active effort to hear and decode, colors that forgot that the Mediterranean is blue, women that Homer gave everything to, and Nolan gave almost nothing. It's magnificent, yet frustrating. It's absolutely worth, though, seeing on the biggest IMAX screen you could find. And though it will not win Best Picture, go see it anyways. And then you can come argue with me for. I'm Eddy Cara, and this has been episode 203 of Real Talk with Eddy Cara.